Alcatraz, a name to bring desolation and fear to men from its earliest days, as a symbol of punishment, as a sign of man's inability to cope with man without violence and repression, a place of unkindness and brute force and hatred and inhumanity. Alcatraz. They called it the Island of Pelicans, the first Spaniards who saw it when they came here in the 18th century. That was all that was there. Pelicans, seagulls, and rock. Almost no soil and certainly no water. The Indians of the surrounding Bay Area thought the place was damned. Perhaps they were more right than any of the white men who would try to make use of the ugly outcropping in San Francisco Bay during the next 2 centuries. Alcatraz started with Indians and seagulls. And who knows, perhaps these will be the sole survivors at the end. I'm Howard Duff. As an actor, I'm deeply interested in drama, and this is possibly one of the most dramatic pieces of land in the world. As a human being and an actor who started out playing prison roles, I'm fascinated with what has transpired in this most famous of penitentiaries. So I tried to learn what has taken place there from the very beginning. It's an extraordinary story, a story of lives hidden away and largely forgotten by society in the name of society. Since the beginning of man's history, he's imprisoned his fellow man on small islands. Elba and St. Helena are probably best known to people who've read history. The Chateau d'If in the harbor of Marseille, and infamous Devil's Island in French Guiana. The United States has had its share of sea-bound dungeons before Alcatraz. Deer Island in Boston Harbor, Welfare Island off Manhattan, and in the Dry Tortugas, the foul Bastille where Dr. Mudd spent so many years for having set the leg of Lincoln's assassin. In 1775, a few months before the U.S. Constitution was signed, a not very important lieutenant of Portola's discovery expedition named Juan de Ayala had himself rowed around the island. He didn't bother to go ashore, the forbidding little outcropping. He just marked a small circle on his map and called the place, quite casually, like a mongrel dog met on the street, Isla de los Alcatrazes, Isle of Pelicans. It was 1,675 feet long, 590 feet wide, 135 feet high at mean tide. Not a very impressive piece of real estate. The Spaniards put a few guns there, nothing else. When the United States took over in 1849, General Fremont bought the place for $5,000 and put a lighthouse on it. A few years later, in 1868, it became a prison for the Army. First for Confederates caught on the West Coast, then for rebellious Indian chiefs, Geronimo among them. Finally, for tough soldier convicts. It was not until 1934, in the last hours of Prohibition, that Alcatraz really became a total, full-fledged dungeon, when the Federal Bureau of Prisons took over and turned it into a maximum security institution for the worst hoodlums of the worst hoodlum era America had ever known. For such wild criminal turbulence, FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover and James B. Bennett, head of the United States Bureau of Prisons, agreed they had no choice other than total seclusion of the nation's top lawbreakers. The Rock. Early on the morning of October 11, 1934, after having been transported via a secret and circuitous route from the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas, the first batch of convicts arrived, barged across in their railway cars from the Western Railhead at Benicia, California, 2 miles across the bay from Alcatraz. Handcuffed and leg-ironed behind the barred windows of the coaches were 137 of the nation's toughest gunmen, most of them bank and mail robbers, many murderers and jailbreakers, all troublemakers in the eyes of prison people. They were guarded by over 60 special agents of the FBI, United States Marshals, railway security men. Escape was impossible. Awaiting them at their destination was a specially selected and trained staff of 155 guards. No rehabilitation technicians or recreation supervisors as in other prisons. Recreation and rehabilitation weren't matters of consideration at the nation's #1 dungeon. Here, security was the name of the game. Repressions didn't count. The chaplain could take care of the humanitarian needs when there was time. Heading up the welcoming committee were two iron men, James Johnson, the first warden of the Rock, and J.E. Shuttleworth, the associate warden and disciplinarian. They were to operate by the book. It was a hard book. As one man put it several years later in federal court, where he'd gone to protest conditions at the prison, you get justice all right, just I-C-E. Alvin Karpus, member of the notorious Barker gang of the 1930s, served the longest continuous sentence on the Rock. In retrospect of 33 years, his recollections of his own arrival still are vivid.
Here's the message everybody got there. We got nothing here, and we don't pretend to have anything for you. No rehabilitation, we don't care. Just make it light on yourself. That was the message.
And that message meant, in effect, that you would be adequately fed and clothed and given a bunk to sleep in, provided you obeyed the rules. But there would be nothing else you could expect. No recreation, no hobbies, nothing.
But there was no hobbies there, no. They didn't encourage any hobbies there. They wanted this thing as downright simple so they could control it, you see. Some of the people that were the biggest boosters for the place in connection in high places with the Bureau of Prisons say now that even the memory of it should be wiped from the face of the earth. Well, that's rather ironical when they were the ones that instituted and installed the system.
The Rock's new guests weren't exactly put at ease by the opening amenities. After a few words from Warden Johnson about doing their own time and not the other man's, Deputy Shuttleworth explained what the discipline would be like for those unwilling to take the warden's advice. Such penalties would take place in these surroundings, he said. You will receive your punishment of perhaps 10 days in isolation on a restricted diet of bread and water. That will continue while you stay in isolation. Isolation is a dark cell known here as the hole. It consists of nothing but 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. When you sleep, you do so on concrete. When a prisoner's required number of days in the hole expire, he is placed in what is known as solitary confinement. Here he enjoys the nighttime use of a bunk. He gets bread and water for breakfast, a noon meal the same as on the prison main line, and bread and water before he goes to bed. When he comes out of solitary, he goes to his regular cell and is placed in grade. Grade will consist of the following. He will have a red tag placed on his cell door which denotes 3rd grade. He may leave his cell only to go to the mess hall. This will continue for 3 months. If he has not broken any rules in that time, he will be elevated to 2nd grade. Now he may write and receive a restricted number of letters. When he has performed satisfactorily at that level for 30 days, he may be restored to 1st grade with full prison privileges. I wish you good luck in your new life at Alcatraz. A cheery welcome. On the other hand, not an entirely cooperative guest list, nor a very hopeful one. Of the 137 convicts on the arrival list, 83 had life sentences. Some were doing double life, and others had terms that were in effect worse. Life under federal terms can be served in a specific number of years. A 50-year sentence, for instance, takes longer, and more than 25 of those who arrived in the Rock in 1934 were serving jolts adding up to a staggering total of years. Try looking ahead to, say, 40 years of servitude on this harsh little fog-bound island with maybe a third off for good behavior, if you're lucky. You get up at 6:30. At 6:55, you can leave your cell and head for your aluminum tray full of nutritionally balanced diet. At 7:30, work starts in the ships, and at the sound of one blast on a whistle, you shrug on your pea jacket and stumble down the ramps and stairways and through the metal detector to your job. If there are two blasts on the whistle, you depart without a coat. Yes, your day is punctuated by whistles, and you're under a gun every moment. At 11:20, more balanced diet, then a 30-minute rest period in your cell, which you can use to see the doctor, provided you have submitted a written request the night before. You work again until 4:15. Hash at 4:25, and at 4:50, you're locked in your cell for the night. You can watch San Francisco traffic if you're in isolation, the best vantage point, and if you have the heart for it. Senior Correction Officer Larry O'Brien, now retired, was assigned to Alcatraz during the height of its infamy. He recalls certain ways and means of ensuring that the security was not violated.
The main way that we had of keeping up with the inmates on Alcatraz was close observation, close personal observation, a constant checking of bars, doors, locks, and electrical fixtures. We checked everything. There wasn't anything that was left unchecked. And one of the things that I've always laughed about in later years, and I really used to cuss the captain on Alcatraz because he had a habit that I thought was rather sneaky. He would go around and he would file a little place on a window bar or a door bar, and then he would go and get 4 or 5 officers and he would say, make a bar check and give me a written report. And what I mean, that filed place on that door or that window had better be on that report. And I thought this was sneaky until I became a captain and I was wondering about my bars, and I thought, you know, this is the best way I know of to check a bar.
He recalls those years of his career as less than a stimulating experience.
The chief frustration on Alcatraz, I believe, was in the lack of any rehabilitation effort or any education effort that was made on Alcatraz. I felt very much like a zookeeper. At one small period of my life, I lived on a farm. And each morning, I used to go up and get a couple of horses and take them out and hitch them to a plow, and I'd plow the field. When I was on Alcatraz, and I used to go up and get these inmates that were working for me, and I'd take them out and work them, and I'd bring them back, and I'd put them in the cell, count them, take them out and feed them, put them back, count them, take them out again and work them, take them back, put them in their cell, count them, take them out and feed them, bring them back, count them, and then I'd go home. I didn't learn anything except how to count and maximum security. I felt that 4 years of my life was an entire waste. And there was no such thing as privacy. This is another reason that I say that Alcatraz took no chances. They took nothing for granted. They had a rule of silence, and inmates were not allowed to talk to each other at work or not allowed to talk to each other at the meal. And of course, this is a terrible way for people to have to live.
Some of the newcomers settled rapidly into the harsh prison routine. Machine Gun Kelly, convicted of kidnapping Oklahoma oilman Charles F. Urschel in 1933, was assigned to the paint shop. He has been quoted as saying he merely drifted along on the tide of time. Eventually, he would be transferred to Leavenworth, where he would die of a heart attack. Harvey Bailey was also convicted of the Urschel kidnapping, although his defense contended that the ransom money found in his pocket had been given to him by Kelly in payment of a debt. Whatever the case, he remained in prison until his eventual parole at 80 years of age. He was considered too hot for outside work because of his history of prison breaks and was made a cell house orderly. Roy Gardner, sometimes termed the last of the Old West bad men, and with a criminal record spanning 30 years, made the mat shop, constructing insulated mats for use on the docks. Once he had broken out of prison aboard a speeding locomotive. He would learn his lesson and mend his ways, but soon after his release from Alcatraz, he would make his final escape via the suicide route. Whitaker and Means of Lindbergh case infamy were assigned to cleanup detail in the yard under the guns of 2 towers. Albert Bates, convicted with Machine Gun Kelly in the Urschel kidnapping, continued to exchange correspondence with his victim in an almost friendly manner. Millionaire beer baron and rackets boss Scarface Al Capone, serving a 10-year sentence for income tax evasion, had been transferred from Atlanta because of his gangland connections. And Alvin Karpus, in the course of time, landed a job as the first convict clerk at Alcatraz. Sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to kidnap wealthy St. Paul brewer William Ham, Jr., his central file also lists 15 bank robberies, 2 kidnappings, 4 murders, and 3 jailbreaks. Larry O'Brien's criticism of these and others is somewhat severe. Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz, receives his share of attention.
I don't know what a psychiatrist would have said about Stroud, but believe me, I wanted nothing to do with him. I know of others that I considered incorrigible. Kelly, Bailey, Bates, Karpus, I felt would in time come around. Karpus, apparently at least, didn't have the hatred for everybody that wore a badge, though he did hate some of them about as much as anybody can be hated. However, I worked with Karpus quite a while, and we established a pretty good relationship.
Karpus had been one of the last of the most wanted criminals of his time to fall. Thus, when he arrived at Alcatraz, he found himself among many of his old acquaintances from the outside. An illustrious circle it was.
There was at least a dozen that I'd run around with at one time or another. You know, there was Machine Gun Kelly and Bates, Holden and Keating, Harvey Bailey. See, there was several more there that I had known at one time or another outside.
Smarter than the rest, he knew that survival came first in the order of importance, and survive he did, even though he was facing a sure 15 years on the rock before becoming eligible for parole. He was not to be allowed parole and would serve an additional 18 years before his release and deportation in 1969. 33 years in all. But Karpus, probably the most notorious of all the bad men of his period, is alive, well and prosperous. He lives in Montreal and recently has written a book. His view on Alcatraz and the American policy of correction are pungent, tough-minded, and unforgettable. Bank robber and kidnapper Alvin Karpus, sometimes known to another generation of Americana as Old Creepy, obtained his freedom in 1969. He now lives here in Montreal, Canada, after having lived and survived 26 years on the Rock, plus another 7 years at McNeil Island in the state of Washington. Born Francis Alvin Karpovitz, August 10, 1908 in Montreal, he moved with his parents to Topeka, Kansas before he was of school age. Later, he sold newspapers in the sleazier part of town, and by age 10, his associations had afforded him a liberal knowledge of the half-world of petty crime, pimps, and prostitutes. Already he'd been in several scrapes with the law, and in the next 15 years would rob many a bank, and according to the FBI statement, kill many a man. It is probable that the only thing that would save him from eventual execution would be his apprehension and conviction by the feds. Uncle Sam's courts dole out severe penalties, but rarely execute. Thus, Alvin Karpus, ironically, benefited from the severity of his well-earned penalties. He was a member of what J. Edgar Hoover labeled the toughest gang we ever cracked. Ma Barker, alleged to have been the head of that gang, finally, along with her younger son Freddie, was machine-gunned to death in their Florida hideout. Alvin Karpus was absent at the time, but his career also terminated shortly thereafter in New Orleans. According to official reports of the period, he was the only fugitive ever personally busted by Mr. Hoover. Karpus's version of his downfall is a little different.
Well, all I can say about this is that if that version of my arrest is any criteria, you know, as to the rest of the contents of this book, oh boy, they should put it right on a shelf for fairy tales, because that's what that book is about. If it's no more accurate, the rest of it, than the way they described my capture in New Orleans.
This high-voltage criminal and leading gangland figure of the Prohibition era is now a respectable and respected citizen of Montreal. But when he was sent to Alcatraz in the fall of 1936, his stay there was to encompass almost the entire history of the Rock in its function as the most maximum of maximum security prisons. His views, in retrospect, are pungent. His reactions as strong and traumatic as on the wet, bleak, foggy morning he arrived on the Rock.
It's hard to explain that to you. Every guy, when he gets in prison, he don't think he's going to stay there long. Something will happen. But in my case, I wasn't kidding myself. The only thing I had going for me there, every year they'd talk about breaking the place up, you know, doing away with it. Well, that kind of kept things going. I didn't think I'd want to try to escape from there. It was just too tough. And I thought, well, if we get transferred, they break the place up, I have a little better shot at it. So over the years, you keep going like that. One thing will give you a little hope in this direction, another one will knock it out, and then something else will occur, and you say, well, maybe. But actually, it was not until 1955 that I even thought I had a ghost of a chance about anything, and only then, because the man that came back there is a warden, and he was a fairly decent sort of a guy for a job like that.
Could the Justice Department have picked a worse place?
I don't believe they could have, because as a matter of fact, they were going to establish it in southeast Alaska. On an island, the Attorney General went over and picked a site. Him and his wife were on an Army transport, and as they came back into the Golden Gate there, they seen this big sign across there, you know, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks. So he inquired around, and they wound up subleasing this thing for 5 years from the Army. But then the propaganda got so great for them, and this thing, you know, it was a big mysterious deal, you know, according to them, and it sort of took the imagination of the news media, the people, and everything, and the first thing you know, it was worth millions to them, and just in propaganda alone. And I might add at this point, it was probably the greatest fraud that was ever put off on the American people for that length of time. I think it lasted about 28 years or so, and they had the American people completely fooled. It was a real bad place, yes. But I would like to make it perfectly clear, I'm not sniveling about my treatment there or anything like that. It's just, it was so unnecessary. When you take a group of men, you deprive them of everything but the fact that they're having their meals and a place to sleep, no newspapers, no radio. Of course, there's people that will say, well, what the hell did they want? What did they get in trouble for if they don't like it? But the government had 20,000 other prisoners that they didn't treat in that manner. So, no, it wasn't necessary.
Officer O'Brien believes differently, at least in point of time.
The 20s and 30s spawned a different, brainier, more reckless, more ruthless type of criminal. He was armed with weapons, cars, and even airplanes of a much more sophisticated nature than any police department was allowed by their rather stringent budgets. Because of this, they were many times able to outperform the police. This condition eventually brought into being the FBI, the G-man of the 30s, and it also brought into being Alcatraz, as some place had to be built or found which was strong enough to hold these people, and Alcatraz was a natural. Their money, connections, ruthfulness, and viciousness made ordinary penitentiaries utterly impractical. Remember, these men all had prior records and were well known. It took an Alcatraz to hold such men, and just as importantly, to hold their gangland friends, and in some cases, their relations out. As I view the picture in retrospect, there is a great deal on the affirmative side and very little on the negative side. Probably the most negative was the financing and lack of recreation and education. But in the overall picture, in answer to the question, was Alcatraz needed? Was it a necessity? I can only answer, you're darn right it was.
Former public enemy number one, Alvin Karpus, doesn't appear overly impressed by the tough guy reputations of the residents of Alcatraz.
Well, I'll tell you what I found about Alcatraz anyway, and I think this goes for a lot of those places. Usually these guys, when they're looking for trouble, they finally run into some guy that is looking for the same thing, and when they do, something's got to give. You know, there's a lot of people killed there in Alcatraz in one manner or another, and they had the thing flooded at one time with psychotics. They should have actually been in the medical center, see, but these other prisons would recommend that they go to Alcatraz just to get them out, the guy out of their hair. So now they would wind up out there, and hell, and like I say, some of them were real paranoid, you know, and they'd walk up to a guy and say, "What are you watching me for? What are you looking at me for?" and things like that, and it would create a bad, tense situation around the place.
Publicity has painted Al Capone as a lonely outsider, unpopular with his fellow cons, possibly living in fear of his life.
He was all right. He was a very nice guy. I've read so many different stories about his, the way he was in the prison and that he wasn't liked. Well, let's get down to it. You find a guy that everybody likes. There's something wrong with the guy himself, probably. But all in all, he was all right there, just like he was all right before he got in prison. He did his time, and nobody ever heard him complaining or anything. And they gave him a bad way to go there because, well, just like they did me, because of the people in Washington, and nobody wanted to say that they were being easy on some guy, you know, like myself or Capone or Kelly and.
George Machine Gun Kelly was another who made many a front-page headline. Was he also easy to get along with?
Kelly, you know, he had read so much of that those propaganda about himself before he was arrested. He got to believe in himself, I think, a little bit, and it would seem like he never tired of telling about all these escapades, you know. And he had lived a rather fascinating life, and the guy. The only thing he was a little inclined to talk about things that he actually hadn't did. For one time he was describing a hell of a sensational thing. And I got to think, what the hell is he talking about? I was on this thing, and I don't remember him being around there, you know.
I'm a great admirer of San Francisco, which was so close to you on the Rock. Must have been painful to be so near and yet so far from all that life and gaiety.
I tell you what, they couldn't have designed a thing, you know, to make it worse for you. And oddly enough, the isolation block there, you could see San Francisco better than from the main block. The main block, you could only about 30 cells where you could sit, and they used to be choice cells. Why them guys wanted to punish themselves, I don't know. They even go to the extent we used to steal a lens out of the X-ray machine in the hospital and stuff, and a guy would grind down the lens and make telescopes. Well, you could look right in them joints over on Fisherman's Wharf with this, you know.
In spite of the rigid security on the Rock, and the natural hazards of the bay, it's known that a number of men became desperate enough to risk the tremendous odds in all-out bids to escape, although most of them were recaptured or drowned. Both Officer O'Brien and Mr. Karpus recall nearly successful attempts, and one party had a chilling change of heart, thus ending the shortest escape attempt on record.
Yeah, Giles, or Giles, as I know him, was assigned to the crew that worked on the dock. And at that time, during the war, World War II, Army uniforms were sent to Alcatraz to be cleaned and repaired and laundered. Over a period of time, our friend Giles had managed to secret a uniform. Now, this uniform bore the stripes of a staff sergeant, and each time when the boat would land at the dock, the inmates were required to line up along the edge of the dock. And at this time, Giles would take advantage of the 20 or 30 seconds available to him to put a small part of the uniform underneath. So one day, the General Coxey, I believe it was, came in, which was a boat that traveled between San Francisco and Angel Island, stopping at Alcatraz. There was a provost marshal aboard. During the time the boat was tied up at the dock at Alcatraz, which was only a matter of minutes, he noticed a staff sergeant make what was known as a pierhead jump. As the boat pulled away, he said to the officer on the dock, "Who was that staff sergeant that got aboard?" And the officer said, "Staff sergeant? We have no staff sergeants on Alcatraz. We didn't put a staff sergeant on there." And after about 5 seconds thought, the officer called for an immediate emergency count. But by this time, Giles was pretty well along on his way to Angel Island. Of course, he had telephoned Angel Island, and the military police picked up Giles on his arrival. He was possibly the saddest-looking staff sergeant in history. Yeah, I knew Bayless, knew him quite well, in fact, and Bayless did attempt an escape, and it probably was the shortest escape in history. I think that the one thing that we had going for us that day was the temperature of the water, and Bayless found this out when he got in it. And when he found out how cold it was, he immediately turned and headed for the shore.
The only guy that ever made that thing, and that you might say made it, was a kid by the name of Scott. He got over out in there in the evening, right after supper time in the fog, and he was very fortunate in this respect. He didn't go out through the gate, but he got under the bridge, and you may know about this, what they call Dead Man's Current there, that comes back alongside of the shore. He was lucky enough to get into that, and he got up on the shore there right off the Presidio, and some little kids seen him and run home and told their parents. Well, when the police got there, hell, this guy was already in a state of shock. When they got him to the hospital, his temperature was under 95. So if they hadn't picked him up, he would have died right there anyway. But that was, as far as I'm concerned, that's the closest successful escape in Alcatraz.
Did you ever consider escape?
Many, many times, yes. Matter of fact, it's no secret now, but I could have been involved in every one that attempt that occurred there while I was there. But I knew a little something about swimming, and I knew just what kind of condition I was in. And I wasn't about, if they would have told me go on down there, we'll give you half a day, I wouldn't have did it, you know. I wouldn't have jumped in that water. Because the water, as you know, is ice cold, and I couldn't have made it over there.
Mr. Carvis, tell me, during that tough, endless, dreary 33 years, did you ever expect the good life you have now?
I hadn't the slightest idea it would be anything like this. As a matter of fact, when I wake up in the morning, I kind of, you might say, count my blessings in this matter and wonder, is it really happening, you know, because it's been fantastic, the treatment I've been afforded here in Montreal by everyone I've came in contact with.
On the night of May 1st, 1946, there was high tension on Alcatraz. None of the usual shouted remarks between the cells, no rapping to the screws. The captain's office reported very few written requests for interviews, few ducats asking to be seen by the doctor. Everyone seemed to have something on his mind that night, something to keep him quiet and thoughtful. A little after noon on the 2nd, with all work crews at their jobs, convict Marvin Hubbard eyed the clock. It was time. A few minutes later, the incident that sparked the beginning of the end for Alcatraz got underway. Hubbard slipped a butcher knife up the sleeve of his denim shirt, stepped into the main drag between the two southern cell blocks, the Carnes called it Broadway, and approached Officer W.H. Miller. Bernard Paul Coy, a Kentucky bank robber, and a teenage Choctaw gunzel named Clarence Carnes joined Hubbard there from the recesses of C Block. Almost silently, they decked Miller. They were immediately joined by Joseph Paul Kretzer, just out of the hole after a 90-day stint for assault. Together, the foursome awaited Bert Birch, the gun gallery guard, patrolling the cell blocks from a narrow shelf some 12 feet above them. For weeks, maybe months, they'd timed his movements to the second when he'd arrive. They needed Birch. He carried a .30-06 Springfield, a holstered .45 revolver, and a gas billy. Furthermore, he had access to the door to D Block, and through D Block was the road to Liberty, partial Liberty. They needed Birch.
There was 2 floors to the gun gallery, the West Gun Gallery, and Coy, who had made a bar spreader out of some toilet fittings, climbed up to the top where the bars arced over from the outer wall of the gun gallery to the main wall of the cell block. This was the weakest spot in the bars. And he placed the bar spreader between the bars, which were about 6 to 8 inches apart, and spread them until he could get his head through and then his shoulders. And finally, he was in the West Gun Gallery. It was just that simple.
Now they worked like a well-rehearsed acrobatic team. Coy mounted to Hubbard's shoulders, lifted himself to the gallery, entered Birch. Coy strong-armed him. They beat him into unconsciousness. Within seconds, his weapons were in the hands of the convicts. Elapsed time, 12 minutes. The riot was dead ahead.
We went into the office for further assignments. Mr. Miller was there, and it developed that Mr. Miller, when he had left the dock, had come up and charged into the main cell block, taking all of the personnel in the office with him. Most of these people were captured. However, Mr. Miller did succeed in getting out, but only after being shot at and having his face half burnt off with an exploding gas belly.
Immediately, the cons were into D block and releasing other prisoners. Some wanted to join up with the mutineers, others didn't. 7 officers were rounded up and locked into cell 403, which was constructed to hold 2 men. More weapons were obtained. But a fatal mistake had been made. The key to the big door leading to the outside yard had been missed when Carnes, the young Choctaw, had searched the offices. There was no immediate way out of the central prison compound.
Now, Whitey Franklin was the one that Kretzer felt was necessary to the success of the escape during the riot. Kretzer thought Franklin could have picked the lock. Franklin was in isolation. Kretzer didn't know how to operate the electric locks. So Franklin stayed in isolation, and apparently the escape failed on that account.
The original plan was dead now. The plan to reach the yard, knock out the 3 main gun towers, make it down to the prison's small boat harbor, capture the launch, and escape by water. But there still was plenty of action ahead. The trouble had only begun. It was now 2:30. Now the interior of the prison had been turned into a maelstrom of violence, a bedlam of noise and insensate action. Coy had donned a guard captain's uniform. Most of the windows had been shattered to make gunfire easier. Convicts sought out guards they especially hated and abused them. Command officers were slugged and kicked to make them give up that all-important key, which had by now been well hidden. Meanwhile, the siren wailed over the island, and all San Francisco rushed to its windows. Captain Henry Weinhold became the chief subject of the convicts' abuse. "If we're all going to get killed," Kretzer said, "we'll kill you first." "A man can only die once," replied the captain. The con fired 2 .45 slugs into his belly. 6 other officers were shot in a 5-minute sequence of incredible savagery.
We heard the shooting, and some of us thought that the hostages were being shot. And we were right, they were. However, most of them survived, except Miller. Stites was killed later when we attempted to take the gun gallery.
Alcatraz was living up to the direst predictions made for it by all who knew its volcanic potential. Now the world knew that Alcatraz had finally blown up. The entire Bay Area had been aroused, and by the evening of May 2nd, millions of eyes were focused on the explosive little rock dead in the center of San Francisco Bay. Scores of guards from all the federal prisons in the nation were being flown in by Prisons Director Bennett, who would arrive himself late that night. Early in the evening, Warden Johnson decided to have some of his men rush D Block. Kretzner, standing in the sally port at D Block, dropped the first 4 guards to enter the unit. 3 were able to crawl back. 1 was dead. The personnel toll was now 2 dead, 13 badly wounded. 7 men still were imprisoned in cell 403. Gas had failed. The assault had produced a bloody list of casualties. Now Warden Johnston sent to the arsenal at Benicia for demolition bombs. This message was dispatched to the mainland by the associate warden. Serious trouble. Convicts have machine guns in cell house, placed armed guards at strategic locations. Most of our officers imprisoned by rioters. Cannot tell extent of injuries or damage done. Will inform later tonight when we get control. This message was sent at 6:45 p.m. It would be almost 3 days and 3 killings to go before Warden Johnston got the control of his prison he promised.
We had a contingent of Marines arrive at the island to help us in controlling the main body of inmates that were not involved in the riot, and these men were in the yard, and of course the Marines were guarding the wall. When one of our officers went out to inspect the wall, and he found the Marines were loading their weapons, and somebody said, what's going on? And they said, do you hear the names those guys are calling us? We're not going to take that. Well, after talking the Marines out of wiping out all of the inmates on Alcatraz, we proceeded onto our duty. We did need them at the time, and they certainly filled a need, particularly Warrant Officer Buckner, who was very skilled in demolition.
A grenade falling to the ground outside D Block set a grass fire. Fighter planes dived, merely for psychological effect. Destroyers circled offshore. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell from the nearby Army Presidio offered military help. But the 72-year-old warden, smarting under the worldwide publicity he was getting, turned it down.
I could have been involved in that, yes. As a matter of fact, the director of prisons, when he came out there, you know, it was a big thing. You know, they had the FBI and everything. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he called me out and he set me down and he says, Harpus, you knew that this was going to happen, didn't you? Like that. And I said, I sure did. And I got news for you. The officials knew it too. Everybody in the joint knew it. But the officials, when they were told about it, they just thought it was too fantastic to believe. And I said, this all came out later, you know. Everybody's gossiping about it, so why shouldn't I have known about it?
At noon of the second day, convict Hubbard messaged the besiegers suggesting a deal. Warden Johnston agreed to hold off on the shell fire for 1 hour if the cons laid down their arms and surrendered at once. His reply from the mutinous convicts, a rifle bullet dead center through the nearest guard tower. The battle burst out more furiously than ever. Let's go out first class, Kretzer is said to have told his pals.
Coy, Kretzer, Hubbard, Thompson, Shockley, Carnes. I don't believe that any of these men could ever have been rehabilitated, and I don't believe anything could have been done for them, and that the only possibility of them ever being returned to society was with old age. Mr. Buckner, who was the person in command of the contingent, had rifle grenades and ordinary grenades, which he fired and caused to have fired at D Block and at the side of the penitentiary. However, none of these had any effect, and it was finally decided that possibly we would have better luck by drilling a hole in the roof and lowering a charge down into the service corridor, down the center of C Block, and exploding it from up above. So Mr. Miller and Warrant Officer Buckner, accompanied by myself and 2 other officers, who proceeded to the roof where a hole was drilled. In the meantime, Mr. Buckner was preparing a couple of charges. And Associate Warden Miller said, what are we going to do with these? And Mr. Buckner said, well, we'll lower them down to the service corridor and explode them. He said, that should end the riot. Mr. Miller thought a while and said, well, how much damage is it going to do to the cell block? And Buckner looked at him in surprise and said, cell block? There isn't going to be any cell block when these go off. And Miller said, oh, no. He said, we need this. We work here. So Mr. Buckner decided to lessen the charges and lowered some ordinary grenades down, which apparently did the job, as all 3 of them were found dead in the service corridor later.
Alvin Carvis recalls a scene of nightmare proportions.
They had the Marines there. They had a little destroyer sitting out there. They had airplanes flying over it, and this is all over 3 guys with 2 guns. And they shot the place to pieces. They used those concussion grenades, everything else, you know. It was just like a dream, like, you know, a nightmare, because these hand grenades would come down through there and ricochet around, and they would bounce off the walls and explode. All themselves were filled with shrapnel as a result of it. I'm telling you, it was quite a scene.
On the morning of the 3rd day, no sound came from the prison. A well-armed force ascended the hill, warily entered the enclave through the south entry. Wading through knee-high salt water in almost total darkness, they found Kretzer, machine gun in hand, but he was dead. Coy, still wearing Captain Weinhold's uniform, floated in the slimy swamp of water, face down, gun in hand. Hubbard, still holding the carving knife with which he'd started the assault, slumped against a wall, dead, his body still warm. The riot was over. But for Officer Larry O'Brien, there was yet another scene to be completed before the record could be closed.
Of course, the grand finale of the Alcatraz riot occurred sometime later at San Quentin. Shockley and Blackie Thompson, a Amarillo, Texas cop killer, was executed for his part in the riot. I had been assigned to be the officer in charge of the viewing room. I believe I was the only San Quentin personnel in this viewing room other than the executioners. These men strapped Thompson and Shockley in the chair and, as usual, wished them happy landing, at which time Shockley is reputed to have deliberately spit in their face. Thompson took it rather matter-of-factly. He did give me a wan sort of smile, and then it was all over.
But so was Alcatraz. So was Alcatraz as a place of ironclad security and decent penal purpose. Investigation after the fact proved the dread Ultra Bastille was, in fact, a monument to incompetency and completely out of line with modern penological concepts. It produced monsters, and expensively. While other prisons did a good job at between $1,500 and $1,800 a year per man, Alcatraz confined them at $5,000 per convict. And San Francisco was tired of having a human cesspool in her front yard. Her newspapers and mayors reflected this often and loudly. The federal government moved slowly, and a decade later it took its guards, guns, and its gangsters away. It took them to more modern institutions where there is no tidewater dungeon, no sand fleas or rats, no cry of seagulls to accentuate the loneliness and isolation. From the day when the last convict and guard departed from the island, Alcatraz has retreated into a pattern of regression, anticlimax, and decay. The omni-metallic interiors of the buildings, under the onslaught of fog and saltwater corrosion, have rusted and fallen apart. Weeds grow everywhere, and paint peels. Indian groups have squatted on the deserted preserve and exacted their toll of sabotage and destruction. Soon, it is said, even they will have gone. Plans for reclamation of the rock are many and varied, but some believe that in the welter of indecision and acrimony that has developed regarding their execution and funding, nothing will occur, at least not for a while. Meanwhile, the strange, sinister island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, which never has enjoyed the opportunity to be put to happy human use, continues to drift like an abandoned hulk toward an unknown fate, toward perhaps some other ugly usage. Meanwhile, as in the past before the Spaniards came, the seagulls are taking over again.